Story 1. The Demon of São Luís Hospital. In 1985, the São Luís Hospital, located in an isolated area in the countryside of Minas Gerais, Brazil, became the stage for a series of disturbing events. The hospital, already known for its dark history, faced one of its scariest nights when a woman named Dona Esmeralda was admitted with inexplicable symptoms. She had been found at her home in a trance state, murmuring words in an unknown language with her eyes rolled back. That night, the psychiatric ward of the hospital was almost empty, except for Dona Esmeralda and two other patients. At 11:45 p.m., the ward's lights began to flicker, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the corridors, despite no one being around. Nurses reported feeling an unusual cold and a smell of sulfur permeating the air. The ward's clock stopped precisely at midnight, and deafening screams began to echo from Dona Esmeralda's room. The nurses who rushed to her room claimed to have seen something they would never forget. The woman was standing in the center of the room, her eyes completely black, smiling in a sinister manner. The window, which had been locked, violently flew open, and a cold wind knocked over instruments and papers. Dona Esmeralda started to speak with a deep male voice, saying that he was there to take what belonged to him. Desperate, the nurses called the local priest, who arrived at the hospital shortly before 3 a.m. Upon entering the room, he was immediately thrown against the wall as if pushed by an invisible force. With courage, the priest began to pray, and Dona Esmeralda screamed and twisted unnaturally. After hours of prayer and struggle, the room finally calmed down, and the woman collapsed on the floor. When she woke up, she remembered nothing of what had happened, but everyone in the hospital knew that something terrifying had been there. In the following months, patients and hospital staff reported inexplicable events. Lights would turn off by themselves, doors would lock without reason, and distant laughter would echo in the middle of the night. The psychiatric ward ended up being permanently closed, and the hospital was abandoned years later, falling into ruins. Today, the building is deserted, overgrown with vegetation and stories of dark apparitions. Many believe that the spirit that possessed Dona Esmeralda still wanders the dark corridors, waiting for its next victim. Story 2. The Lady in White of Recoleta Cemetery. The Recoleta Cemetery in Buenos Aires, Argentina, is known for its impressive architecture and the tombs of important historical figures. However, it also carries a dark reputation due to the legends that surround its marble corridors, the most famous being the story of the Lady in White, a young woman who died tragically and whose spirit is said to still wander among the graves. At the end of the 19th century, Rufina Cambaceres, the daughter of a wealthy Argentine family, lived a luxurious life, attending social events and enjoying everything that high society had to offer. At 19, Rufina was preparing to go to a gala ball when she suddenly fainted in her room. Doctors were quickly called, but they declared the young woman dead, believing that a sudden heart attack had taken her life. The mourning was immediate, and her family decided to bury her at Recoleta Cemetery the next day. During the funeral, family and friends said their goodbyes to Rufina, who was placed in a sealed coffin, according to tradition. However, that same night, the cemetery's watchman began hearing strange noises coming from the young woman's tomb. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but as he approached, he clearly heard muffled knocks and scratches. Frightened, he called the authorities, who decided to open Rufina's coffin the next day. The sight that followed was terrifying. Rufina's eyes were open, her face was covered in scratches, and her bloody hands showed broken nails. She hadn't died. She had suffered a cataleptic episode, a state in which the body appears to be dead, but the person is alive, conscious, and paralyzed. The young woman had been buried alive, and in her desperation, she tried to escape her fate inside the coffin, to no avail. Her family was devastated, and the story quickly spread throughout the city. Sometime after her death, reports of sightings of a young woman dressed in white began to emerge in the cemetery. They said she walked slowly through the corridors, with a sad expression on her face, occasionally stopping in front of her own tomb, where she had been buried alive. Some claim that her footsteps make no sound and that she appears to float over the cold stones of the cemetery. Even more frightening reports say that, on foggy nights, The figure disappears right before the eyes of those who dare to stare at her for too long. Over the years, cemetery guards reported hearing whispers when passing by the area where Rufina was buried. Some refused to patrol alone at night, claiming that the intense cold they feel, even on hot nights, is a sign that the young woman's spirit is still near. Years later, a tourist swore he captured a photo of the ethereal figure of a woman in white next to Rufina's tomb, but when he looked at the image again, she had vanished. To this day, Rufina Cambassier's tomb is one of the most visited sites in Recoleta Cemetery, and tour guides often share her story with visitors. Some say that the young woman's soul is still seeking justice, while others believe she simply wishes to be remembered. The tomb, adorned with a statue of a young woman about to open a door, symbolizes Rufina's attempt to escape her mortal prison. Visitors leave flowers and letters beside the statue, hoping that one day her soul will finally find the peace it has sought for so long. Story 3. The Strange Case of Anneliese Michel. Anneliese Michel, born in 1952, was a young German woman living in a small town in Bavaria. Raised in a deeply Catholic family, Anneliese was a typical girl until she turned 16, when she began to suffer violent seizures that doctors diagnosed as temporal lobe epilepsy. Believing that medical treatment would solve the problem, Anneliese began taking medication, but her condition quickly worsened, and she started experiencing something that no medicine seemed to cure. Anneliese began hearing voices that insulted her and ordered her to commit violent acts. She saw dark and terrifying figures that no one else could see, and she claimed that demons were trying to possess her. Her terrified family sought religious help, believing that the problem was not medical but spiritual. Local priests, after hearing Anneliese's accounts, concluded that she was possessed by evil forces and decided to perform an exorcism. Thus began a series of rituals that lasted for months. The exorcism sessions were intense and frightening. Anneliese, a frail girl, displayed supernatural strength, needing to be restrained by several people at once. During the rituals, she spoke in unknown languages, twisted in impossible ways, and screamed with voices that did not seem human. The priest recorded that Anneliese claimed to be possessed by several demons, including Lucifer, Cain, and Judas Iscariot. She refused food and water, saying that the voices wouldn't allow her to eat, and her body began to waste away rapidly. Over time, Anneliese's state deteriorated to an alarming point. She inflicted wounds upon herself, showed bite marks, and suffered bruises. During the rituals, the young woman said she was being tortured by entities that wanted to destroy her soul. Her family believed that the demons were trying to break her faith, while the priests, convinced of the possession, intensified the exorcisms. Anneliese would fall into a trance for hours, and her already weakened body barely endured the intense rituals. In 1976, after 67 exorcism sessions over 10 months, Anneliese Michel died from malnutrition and exhaustion. Her death shocked the local community and quickly gained international attention. Her parents and the priest who performed the exorcisms were charged with negligent homicide, as they should have sought medical help instead of continuing the rituals. During the trial, recordings of the exorcisms were presented as evidence, revealing Anneliese's terrifying state in her final moments. Anneliese Michel's case is still widely debated. Some believe that she suffered from a severe psychiatric condition that was misdiagnosed and treated inadequately, while others, including some theologians, view her story as a true spiritual battle between good and evil. After her death, Anneliese's grave became a site of pilgrimage, with people from all over the world visiting, believing that she was a martyr who fought against demonic forces until her last breath. Today, the name Anneliese Michel is synonymous with one of the most documented cases of demonic possession in history. Films, books, and documentaries have been inspired by her life, and her story continues to provoke heated debates about faith, science, and the unknown. Her grave, simple and modest, is decorated with flowers and rosaries, while visitors pray for her soul, hoping that she has finally found the peace that was so cruelly denied to her in life. Story 4. The Curse of the Mary Celeste. In 1872, the Mary Celeste, an American merchant ship, was found adrift in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, with no crew on board, yet in perfect sailing condition. The vessel, which had departed from New York bound for Genoa, Italy, was carrying a cargo of barrels of industrial alcohol, and the entire crew seemed to have disappeared mysteriously, leaving behind one of the greatest enigmas in maritime history. When the British ship Dei Grazia encountered the Mary Celeste, it was slowly sailing, with its sails partially hoisted and showing no obvious signs of damage. Upon boarding the ship, the sailors were perplexed. The cargo was intact, and the crew members' personal belongings remained in their quarters. The logbook was also there, the last entry dated November 25th, about 10 days before the ship was found. There were no signs of struggle, and even the food on the table seemed untouched, as if the crew had abandoned the ship suddenly, with no time to gather their belongings. Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife, their young daughter, and the entire crew had vanished without a trace. The only clue was a missing lifeboat, suggesting that the crew might have tried to escape the ship for some unknown reason. But what could have driven experienced sailors in stable weather conditions to abandon a safe ship in the middle of the Atlantic? This is the question that has puzzled investigators and experts for over a century. In the years that followed, numerous theories emerged, some more rational and others involving the supernatural. One hypothesis suggested that the barrels of alcohol might have started leaking, releasing toxic fumes that could have caused the crew to panic, leading them to abandon the ship as a precaution. Another theory proposed that a natural phenomenon, such as a waterspout, might have frightened the crew, who fled to the lifeboat but were never able to return to the ship. However, none of these explanations satisfied the lack of damage to the Mary Celeste and the absence of signs of a struggle. Over time, the legend of the Mary Celeste grew, and stories of curses began to circulate. Some believed that the ship was cursed from its construction, when, according to rumors, one of the carpenters had died violently while finishing the hull. Others said that Captain Benjamin Briggs, a religious man, had challenged forces beyond his comprehension, awakening something that resulted in the disappearance of everyone on board. Superstitious sailors avoided talking about the Mary Celeste, believing that its name brought bad luck to those who sailed the seas. Decades after the disappearance, stories of ghostly sightings of the ship began to emerge, claiming that it had been seen adrift in various parts of the Atlantic, even long after it had been dismantled and sold as scrap. Some sailors swore they saw the Mary Celeste illuminated by a spectral light, silently sailing through foggy nights, as if its missing crew were still searching for answers about their fate. To this day, the mystery of the Mary Celeste remains unsolved, considered one of the greatest enigmas in naval history. The case continues to fascinate historians, writers, and paranormal investigators, who speculate about what really happened on that fateful Atlantic voyage. The Mary Celeste is a grim reminder that, despite all technological advances, the sea still holds secrets that may never come to light, and that some voyages are destined to remain shrouded in mystery and eternal silence. Story 5. The Enfield Poltergeist. Between 1977 and 1979, the suburb of Enfield in North London became the setting for one of the most famous paranormal manifestations of the 20th century. A typical family, consisting of single mother Peggy Hodgson and her 4 children, began to report strange phenomena in their modest home on Green Street. What started as light knocking on the walls soon turned into a well-documented case of poltergeist activity, attracting paranormal investigators, journalists, and skeptics from around the world. The case began in August 1977, when the youngest daughter, 11-year-old Janet, claimed she felt her bed shaking during the night. Peggy, thinking it was just the child's imagination, ignored the incident. However, the next day, loud noises, similar to furniture being dragged, echoed throughout the house, even when no one was nearby. Gradually, the events intensified. Objects were thrown across the room, chairs moved on their own, and one night, one of the children screamed that a dark figure was standing in the corner of the room. Desperate, Peggy called the local police, who also witnessed inexplicable events, like a chair moving on its own right before the officers' eyes. Not knowing what to do, the family sought help from paranormal investigators, including Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair, members of the Society for Psychical Research. They began spending nights in the house, documenting a series of disturbing phenomena. The manifestations seemed to focus on Janet, who frequently went into trances, spoke with a hoarse and male voice, and demonstrated strength that seemed impossible for a girl her age. The investigators recorded hours of audio where the girl claimed to be Bill Wilkins, an old man who had died in the house years earlier. The recordings showed Janet conversing with this voice while barely moving her lips, something that experts considered proof of possession. Additionally, the investigative sessions documented objects levitating, knocks on the walls that answered questions, and even Janet levitating, which was witnessed on more than one occasion. Photos taken by the investigators showed the young girl suspended in the air, seemingly thrown by an invisible force. The press soon took an interest in the case, and reporters began visiting the house to witness the events, bringing international fame to the Enfield poltergeist. Despite the testimonies and evidence collected, the case divided opinions. Some believed that Janet, a troubled teenager, was fabricating the events for attention. Others, including the investigators, claimed that many of the phenomena simply could not be explained by conventional logic or science. In the years that followed, Janet stated that the events had diminished but never completely ceased, and that a presence still followed her even after she left the house. Today, the Enfield case is considered one of the most documented poltergeist events in history. It inspired movies, documentaries, and books, remaining an intriguing example of the limits between the visible world and the unknown. Many researchers argue that as long as science cannot fully explain what happened in that house on Green Street, the story of Enfield will continue to challenge skeptics and believers alike, serving as a reminder that the inexplicable might be closer than we think. Story 6. The Brown Man of Raynham Hall. Raynham Hall, a majestic 17th century English mansion located in Norfolk County, is famous not only for its beauty but also for being home to one of the world's most well-documented ghostly sightings, the Brown Man. This spectral figure, said to be dressed in an old brown aristocratic outfit, is among the most documented ghostly encounters in England, having been seen by visitors, staff, and even British nobility over centuries. The story of the Brown Man is directly tied to the tragic history of Lady Dorothy Walpole, a beautiful and intelligent woman of English aristocracy who lived in Raynham Hall during the early 18th century. Lady Dorothy was married to Charles Townshend, a man known for his explosive temper and extreme jealousy. Rumors suggested that Dorothy had an affair before her marriage, and upon discovering the betrayal, Charles allegedly kept his wife locked in one of the mansion's rooms until her death. In 1726, Dorothy died mysteriously, officially due to smallpox, but many believed she had been murdered by her husband or that she had succumbed to loneliness and despair. Shortly after her death, reports began of a nebulous figure, dressed in brown, wandering the corridors of Raynham Hall. The figure was always described with a sad and empty gaze, its eyes seeming to be covered by an opaque shadow, and its expression conveying profound sorrow. The first recorded sighting of the Brown Man occurred in 1835 when Colonel Loftus, a visitor to the mansion, encountered the figure in the hallway. He described seeing a tall man wrapped in a brown mist who vanished before his eyes. Loftus, intrigued, reported his experience to the host, but was met with skepticism. However, in the following months, other noble guests reported seeing the same figure, always described with the same unsettling details. In 1936, the apparition of the Brown Man gained worldwide fame when a photograph was taken by two photographers from Country Life magazine. They were at the mansion to document its architecture when, suddenly, they saw a figure descending the grand staircase. They quickly snapped a photo, and to their astonishment, the image revealed a translucent figure descending the steps with a calm and solemn expression. The photo was published, generating a wave of speculation and curiosity about the phenomenon's authenticity. Rumors about the identity of the Brown Man persisted, with many believing it to be the spirit of Lady Dorothy, trapped in Raynham Hall, unable to rest due to the injustices she suffered in life. Residents and visitors claimed to hear whispers in the house, feel abrupt changes in temperature, and witnessed doors opening and closing on their own. The mansion staff avoided walking alone in the hallways at night, stating they could hear light footsteps and echoes of distant laughter. During a restoration of the mansion in the 1960s, workers reported sightings of the brown man, particularly on the grand staircase where the famous photograph was taken. One worker claimed to see the figure standing at the top of the stairs, staring directly at him. When he tried to approach, the figure vanished, leaving only the scent of wilted roses in the air, a fragrance said to be Lady Dorothy's favorite. Even today, Raynham Hall remains a tourist attraction, drawing visitors from around the world, many of whom hope to catch a glimpse of the infamous brown man. The legend lives on, fueled by new reports of people claiming to have seen the figure wandering the corridors, especially during winter storms when the thunder seems to echo the sorrow Lady Dorothy carried to her grave. Raynham Hall is a reminder that the past, even when hidden behind closed doors, has a way of manifesting, and that some stories, laden with pain and injustice, can echo through eternity. As long as the brown man continues to be seen, his story will continue to be told, and Raynham Hall will maintain its title as one of England's most haunted mansions. Story 7. The Blair Witch, the truth behind the legend. The legend of the Blair Witch began in the late 18th century in the town of Blair, now known as Burkittsville, Maryland, USA. The town gained notoriety after a series of tragic events involving the disappearance of children and gruesome murders, all supposedly linked to a woman named Ellie Kedward, who was accused of witchcraft and exiled from the community. Banished in the harsh winter of 1785, Ellie was tied to a tree in the forest and left to freeze, a cruel punishment for the alleged crimes that were never proven. In the months following Ellie Kedward's exile, local children began to mysteriously vanish. Many believed Ellie had returned from the dead to seek revenge on those who condemned her. The town, haunted by fear, was gradually abandoned, and the forest around Blair became avoided, earning a dark and dangerous reputation. It was said that those who ventured too far into the depths of the forest would never return. In 1824, a group of settlers trying to colonize the area again encountered a series of strange carvings on the trees, forming a macabre circle near a stream. An improvised cemetery was discovered, and the graves bore symbols that no one could decipher. The group decided to abandon the area after several members vanished without a trace, and the legend of the Blair Witch grew stronger, becoming a ghost story passed down through generations. In the 20th century, the legend resurfaced when, in 1940, 7 children disappeared near the place known as Witch's Creek. A man named Rustin Parr was arrested and convicted of the murders, claiming that the witch had forced him to kill. Parr was executed, but many believed he was merely a pawn of something far more sinister that inhabited the depths of the forest. After his death, the forest remained avoided, and reports of paranormal activity only intensified. In 1994, 3 film students decided to investigate the legend of the Blair Witch and disappeared mysteriously after entering the forest to film a documentary. The tapes, found months later, showed disturbing images, sounds of children laughing in the night, ghostly figures among the trees, and strange symbols hanging from branches. The recordings ended abruptly, with the students desperately running through the forest, seemingly pursued by an invisible force. To this day, the legend of the Blair Witch is recounted as one of America's greatest supernatural mysteries. The forest, now known as the Blair Witch Forest, is a place avoided by hunters and explorers. It is said that if you get lost in there, the witch will do everything to make sure you never leave. Those who visit Burkittsville speak of a heavy, suffocating atmosphere that hangs over the area, and that at night, whispers and laughter can be heard in the distance, coming from the direction of the forest. Whether reality or superstition, the story of the Blair Witch is a reminder that sometimes legends have deep roots in reality, and that certain places are better left untouched. As long as the forest continues to exude its aura of mystery and death, the legend of the Blair Witch will remain alive, scaring new generations and keeping its dark secrets hidden in the eternal shadows of the trees. Story 8. Waverly Hills Sanatorium. At the top of a hill in Louisville, Kentucky, stands the old Waverly Hills Sanatorium, an imposing and decaying structure, covered in moss and surrounded by trees that seem to whisper in the wind. Opened in 1910, the hospital became one of the largest sanatoriums for tuberculosis treatment in the United States. During the height of the epidemic in the early 20th century, it is estimated that more than 60,000 people died there, many under distressing circumstances, and the site became notorious for its experimental and often inhumane medical practices. In the 1920s and 1930s, when there was no cure for tuberculosis, treatments such as pneumothorax, the intentional collapse of a lung, and thoracoplasty, the removal of several ribs to allow the lungs to expand, were frequently performed. Patients underwent painful surgeries, often without adequate anesthesia. Many did not survive, and the hospital soon earned a grim reputation as a place of death. To avoid the sight of dead bodies disturbing the living patients, a tunnel was built under the sanatorium, known as the Death Tunnel. Through it, bodies were discreetly transported to trucks that carried them away. Over the years, stories of paranormal activity began to accumulate. Nurses and doctors claimed to hear whispers in the empty hallways, see shadows lurking behind doorways, and feel sudden drops in temperature. One of the most frightening stories was about a tall man dressed in white, who roamed the old corridor of the children's ward, where sick children were treated. It is said that he emitted a strong smell of tobacco and vanished at the end of the hallway, only to reappear moments later in another part of the hospital. Another famous story involves room 502, where two nurses took their own lives under mysterious circumstances. One, in 1928, allegedly hanged herself from a beam, while the other, in 1932, jumped out of the window after claiming that something was chasing her. Visitors who dare enter room 502 often report feeling a pressure on their chest, as if being watched by an invisible presence, and hearing slow, dragging footsteps on the ceiling, even when they are alone in the building. After the discovery of penicillin and the decline of tuberculosis, the hospital closed in 1961, only to reopen as a psychiatric hospital. However, the conditions were so poor that it was permanently shut down in 1982. After its closure, Waverly Hills was abandoned, becoming a target for thrill seekers, curious onlookers, and paranormal investigators. Many who spent the night there claimed to hear voices echoing through the halls, feel icy touches on their shoulders, and see shadows moving swiftly between the shattered windows. One of the most disturbing legends is that of the ball boy. It is said that the spirit of a young patient who died of tuberculosis at the hospital still plays in the halls. Investigators frequently reported hearing the sound of a ball bouncing along the wooden floors of the second floor. A filming crew, while reviewing their footage, claimed to have captured a childlike figure running through the hallways, disappearing through a wall. Despite all the frightening reports, Waverly Hills still attracts tourists and paranormal investigators from all over the world. Today, the sanatorium is considered one of the most haunted places in the United States, with guided tours for those seeking an encounter with the inexplicable. At night, the atmosphere is heavy, and the sound of wind passing through the broken windows seems to carry the laments of those who suffered there. For many, Waverly Hills Sanatorium is living proof that walls can retain the suffering and stories of those who perished within, and that some souls never find rest. The imposing silhouette of the hospital at night is a dark reminder that sometimes the past leaves marks that time cannot erase. Story 9. The Curse of Robert the Doll. In the early 20th century in Key West, Florida, a strange story involving a cursed doll began to circulate. The doll, named Robert, belonged to a boy named Robert Eugene Otto, better known as Gene. The doll, nearly a meter tall, wore a sailor's outfit and had a smiling yet unsettling expression. According to legend, it was given to Gene by a servant of the family, who allegedly practiced voodoo and black magic. Soon after receiving the doll, inexplicable events began to occur in the Otto household. Gene, who initially adored the doll, began to treat Robert as if he were a living being. He would talk to the doll for hours, and strangely, Gene's parents claimed to hear another voice responding, one that did not sound like Gene's. Objects disappeared or were destroyed, and Gene always blamed the doll, saying that Robert did it. The situation worsened when neighbors began reporting seeing the doll move from window to window, even when the house was empty. One night, Jean's parents awoke to their son's desperate screams. When they entered his room, they found the furniture overturned, toys destroyed, and Jean curled up in a corner, pointing at the doll and yelling that Robert was trying to kill him. Despite this, Jean refused to part with the doll, keeping it with him throughout his childhood and even into adulthood. Jean grew up, became an artist, and eventually inherited his parents' house. He kept Robert the doll in a special room in the attic, saying that the doll needed its own space. Jean would spend hours in that room talking to the doll and his wife and began to fear the influence the doll had over her husband. She claimed to hear footsteps in the attic at night and faint laughter, but Jean always reassured her, saying it was just Robert playing. After Jean's death, the house was sold, and Robert the doll was donated to the Martello Museum, where it remains to this day. Even in the museum, Robert continues to be the center of scary stories. Visitors report seeing his eyes move, changing expressions, and some claim to hear faint laughter when approaching the doll. Museum staff state that if you take a picture of Robert without asking permission, you may be cursed. The museum receives dozens of letters every year from people apologizing to the doll for not respecting its presence. It is said that after taking photos without permission, visitors experienced inexplicable accidents, lost their jobs, or faced a series of misfortunes until they asked for forgiveness. Many believe that Robert is more than just a doll. He is a vessel for something that transcends human understanding, something awakened decades ago and still active today. Robert, the cursed doll, is an example of how seemingly innocent objects can carry dark stories and forces beyond logic. He remains in a glass case at the museum, with a sign warning visitors to treat the doll with respect. The legend of Robert continues to grow, attracting the curious and the brave, all willing to look into the eyes of one of the most haunted dolls in the world, though few dare to challenge him. Story 10. The Ghost Train of St. Louis. In 1920, in the town of St. Louis in the Canadian province of Saskatchewan, a small and quiet rural village was shaken by reports of an unexplained phenomenon, a ghost train traveling along abandoned tracks on the outskirts of town. For decades, local residents claimed to see strange lights and hear the sound of a train whistle in the distance, even though no rail train had crossed the tracks for many years. The story became a local urban legend, known as the St. Louis Ghost Train. The first documented sighting occurred in the autumn of 1920 when a farmer, returning home at dusk, saw bright lights moving slowly along the abandoned tracks. Intrigued, he followed the light to the tracks but found nothing but darkness. In the days that followed, other residents reported seeing a bright white light hovering over the tracks, which seemed to change color to red before disappearing into the cold night air. The mystery deepened when some claimed to hear the sound of screeching metal and the high-pitched whistle of a train, even when they were miles away from the tracks. The sounds were so real that many ran to check for the arrival of a train that never appeared. Soon, the phenomenon attracted the attention of ghost hunters and curious visitors, who traveled to the small village hoping to witness the ghost train themselves. Local legend said that decades earlier, a conductor had been accidentally decapitated while trying to fix a problem on the tracks on a cold, foggy night. It was believed that the white light many saw was the lantern he carried, searching for his lost head. Some visitors, on particularly dark nights, claimed to see the silhouette of a man holding a lantern, slowly walking along the tracks before vanishing into the shadows of the surrounding forest. In the 1970s, a group of paranormal investigators decided to study the phenomenon up close. They set up camp next to the abandoned tracks, armed with recording equipment and cameras. On the first night, little happened beyond the occasional sound of wind through the trees. But on the second night, around 2 in the morning, a bright light appeared in the distance, moving rapidly towards the group. The sound of a train whistle echoed loud and clear, and the investigators froze in fear as a ghostly form passed by them, emitting a chilling breeze that sent shivers down their spines. The recording equipment captured only static and distorted noises, but the cameras took photos of something astonishing. A bright, train-shaped light, blurred and indistinct as if it were in motion. The group, terrified, left the area before dawn, swearing never to return. The evidence they collected, while inconclusive, only served to increase the ghost train's fame. To this day, people continue to visit St. Louis in search of the phenomenon. Many tourists claim to see the strange light along the abandoned tracks, while others report only a sense of unease and intense cold. The legend has become part of the town's identity, and local guides organize nighttime tours, leading the curious to the old tracks in hopes of witnessing the ghost train. It is said that if you hear the sound of the train's whistle, you should close your eyes and not look at the light, for those who look directly at it have weeks of disturbing dreams, filled with images of tracks and a shadowy figure holding a lantern. The St. Louis ghost train is a reminder that even in the most peaceful and rural places, stories of hauntings can emerge, fueled by past tragedies and memories that time cannot erase. The question that still remains is, what really causes the mysterious light and the sounds that echo along the abandoned tracks? Is it a play of natural lights and sounds, or something deeper? A spirit continuing its relentless search even beyond death? If you've made it this far, don't forget to smash that like button to support the channel, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest. See you in the next story.